This video demonstration is going to be about enhancing contrast and colors in your image. So the very first thing that you need to do when you open up a photograph in Photoshop is make a copy of your background. We're going to click on that layer in your layers panel and drag it down to the new layer page. And let's name this retouch. This is where you'll do all of your actual manipulating of your image. When you want to adjust the contrast and the vibrance, which are two things really that you need to make sure that you have a lot of when you're editing photographs for photography, in doing this, it just makes your image appear much more three-dimensional. And what we're trying to do as photographers is to make our images come to life in the way that we saw them whenever we were standing right in front of that. So this is a really nice image. However, it really just needs some bumping up of the shadows and the highlights, and then also just the richness of the color overall. So there are quite a few things that you can use in order to do this. Three different adjustments that you can work with: brightness, levels, curves, and exposure to adjust shadows and highlights and things like that. And then vibrance and hue and saturation for color. So what I typically do is I will go to curves and I will just create a slight S curve to create some contrast. So what that does is that deepens my shadows and brightens up my highlights. And if I turn the eyeball off and on, you can see that that's already changed that quite a bit. You can also click on auto and Photoshop will kind of generate the contrast for you as well. You can also, I'll just go ahead and trash that, use levels, and you can use any of these adjustments in tandem with each other as well too. What you can do is, it looks like from looking at my histogram that I actually need more shadows. I have quite a bit of midtones and I have quite a bit of highlights, but really not a whole lot of deep shadows. So I can take the slider and move it to the right, and that will enhance the shadows in my image. And if I actually pull that back and click auto, I guarantee that the slider is going to shift to the right because it wants to add more. And there you go, you just saw that. So creating more sort of depth between the shadows and then the highlights in the image. You can also click on brightness and contrast. I feel like the image is actually overall a little too bright, so I could pull that down just a little bit, and then I could pull up the contrast slider to create that variation between those shadows and highlights again. So this is how I just adjusted it, but if I click auto, Photoshop will generate its own way of adjusting the contrast, and it actually did it pretty similar to the way that I just did too. All right, so let's go ahead and leave that there, and let's talk about color now. Let's go to the vibrance adjustment. And only two things that you can adjust here. You can adjust the vibrance and you can adjust the saturation. Typically what you want to do, unless you're working with a photograph that has an overall kind of gloomy or moody or aged look, you'll want to pull up the vibrance. And really what that's going to do is that's just going to kind of intensify the colors for you. You have to be careful because sometimes it'll do it maybe too much. So like I pulled this up all the way to 100 and it really brought out the blues right here, which I could get rid of if I wanted to as well. But be careful that you're not kind of overdoing it with the color. Saturation is just the richness or the amount of color that is coming through. So if you lower that, it'll kind of lower the richness, and if you raise that up, it'll intensify it. And again, this is something that's good to use, but also just with a light touch, okay? So before and after, so those colors have really just popped a lot and made the image come to life. Another thing that you can use is hue and saturation. So if you need to adjust the colors in any way, you can adjust this slider right here for hue. Obviously, what you would need to do is you would need to use layer masks in order to get rid of areas that you don't want. But if you need to just ever so slightly adjust colors, you can do that with the hue. And then again, this is just another location for saturation. So if you need to really intensify and kind of richen up those colors, you pull it to the right. And then if you need to desaturate it in order to make it look aged or something like that, then you can pull down the saturation as well. Okay, pull that up. And let's go ahead and turn off the eyeballs on both of these just so we can see what enhancing the contrast and color did with just two basic adjustments. So turn these off. So that was before and that was after. So really just with subtle adjustments and subtle tweaking of the shadows and the highlights and then also the colors, it's really brought this image to life. So make sure that you are doing these with every single image that you work with.